So I just knit an additional 5 rows. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 from our initial color work pattern. And at this point, from my beginning to my end, I have 24 rows. So I'm ready to start shaping the fingers. So to do that, first gonna knit 10 rows across after my initial stitch marker. So the stitch marker marks the end of my round. So I'm going to knit 10 stitches past that. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now because this stitch marker marks the end of my row, it would correspond to this position right here. You can see. And because I want my fingers to be symmetrical and line up right in the center, I'm going to knit one more stitch so that it lines up right in the center here. So now I have 11 stitches. I'm going to slip 10 of these onto double pointed needles, size 1s. Stitches, and I'm going to slip an additional 10 stitches onto another double pointed needle. Just like so. So now ignoring the stitches on my circular needle, we can see that we have the 10 stitches corresponding to the beginning of our round and the 10 stitches corresponding to the end of our round on our needles. And these are going to be used to form the index finger. So to help me a little bit, I'm going to slip the remaining stitches onto a smaller needle, like so, just so I can remove my circular needle and not have it get in the way. Okay, just like this. So you can see our glove is already taking shape, and this is corresponding to our index finger right here. Taking another double pointed needle, and we're going to form a round, this time going all the way back and forth just across these 20 stitches right here. First, we're going to do a twisted cast on and just cast on 2 more stitches, like so. Then to avoid any holes in my new round, I'm actually going to slip these first 4 stitches onto my 3rd double pointed needle. And I'm going to knit all the way across, just so I can have really tight connection here. Okay. And before I forget, I'm going to slip 3 of those stitches back. Trying not to drop my stitches in the meantime. Just putting it back in their correct position. So I should have 11 stitches on each needle now, and I have a round of 22 stitches total. I'm going to take my stitch marker, I no longer need it in that position, and I'm going to put it at the start of my new round, corresponding to the beginning stitch right here. First stitch on my first frontmost needle. And from this point on, I'm just going to knit across these stitches and around until I have my desired length. For the size medium, I'm going to knit across these stitches in stockinette stitch as shown for a total of 36 rounds. And if it's easier, you're welcome to expand this circular round with more needles, so you can have 3 double-pointed needles. But I find that this small round 2 is usually enough. You can see our index finger starting to take shape right here. So I'll be back when I finish knitting the rest of the index finger to work the tip shaping. So I just finished knitting 36 rows for my index finger. You can see I have a stitch marker on this side to help me count my rows, and then the green stitch marker over here is for me to know where my beginning of the round is. So this stitch marker is marking the 30 rows I've knit, plus an additional 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows. Now we're ready to work the decreases for the finger shaping. So positioning my needles, I'm going to work just knit 2 together all the way across in this first round. Knit 2 together, just like this. Knit 2 together. Oops, trying not to drop my stitches. Knit 2 together. And one more. So I had 11 stitches on this needle, so I have 1 extra. I'm just gonna slip it directly onto my next needle. Just slip that on, making sure it's not twisted in any way. And knit 2 together. Just continuing like this all the way to the end of my round. Okay, that was the last knit 2 together, and I'm done. For the next shaping round, we're gonna work a knit 2 together, knit 1, all the way across our round. So knit 2 together. Making sure that first stitch is fairly tight so we don't have a hole in our round. Knit 1. And we're going to repeat that all the way across. So now I did a knit 2 together, knit 1, knit 2 together. Next stitch I'm going to do is a knit 1. Knit 1. Again, making sure this stitch is fairly tight so I don't have a hole between my needles. And a knit 2 together. Just like so. Knit 1. And knit 2 together. So for this finger that is made up of 22 stitches, I should be left with 7 stitches at the end after my fingertip shaping. From this point on, I can take a scissor, cut my working yarn, leaving about a 2 to 3 inch tail. Next, I'm going to take a darning needle or a crochet hook, whichever one I have available. In this case, just a darning needle. And I'm just going to sew this through all of my live stitches and pull tight at the end. So threading my darning needle, and now just slipping those stitches directly onto my darning needle, pulling through, slip the remaining 4 stitches, and now I'm going to pull tightly, and that should close my finger. You can see we don't have any gaps, and we can then weave in this tail later. But for now, I'm just going to leave it like this and weave in all the ends after I've completed all the fingers. Just going to remove my stitch markers. I no longer need them in those positions. And I'm going to get ready to work the next finger. Okay, so I have my working yarn. Take my needles, and I'm going to slip the next 9 stitches on either side of my hand. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Just position these to make it a little bit easier for me. Okay, and I'm going to slip the next 9 over here. Nine stitches. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. There we go. So now to start working, we're going to actually start in between these 2 fingers where we have our cast on stitches. So using my 3rd needle, I'm going to start working. You can sort of see the cast on edge of those 2 stitches we did the twisted cast on for. So this is 1 stitch, this is another. We're going to want to knit directly through these, and we're going to pick up 2 stitches right here. In the first round, I'm going to pick up just 1 and then come back around and pick up the next one, so that we're going to have eventually another 22 stitch round. For now, I'm just going to pick up the 2 legs of my cast on stitch, and then to avoid having a hole like I would between a sock, just pick up stitches here, make sure that I don't have a hole. There's really no real science to this. You just want to make sure you're picking up stitches and the eventual result doesn't give you a hole. So for me, there's a slight hole, but if I knit this next stitch, that pretty much closes up. You can't really see it, so I like that result. I'm just going to keep it. One thing to note, you want to have a fairly long tail. Maybe position these a little. So I want to have about a 2 to 3 inch tail over here as well, just in case I need to sew this closure. Let's say I don't pick up the stitches the way I like and I eventually have a hole here, then it's really helpful to come back and sew with this tail right here. And it doesn't have to be very long, 2 to 3 inches is usually enough. Okay, I'm gonna knit all the way across my first 9 stitches. Like so. And just trying to tighten up this tail. I don't want a hole over here. Now, like we did with our index finger, we're going to do a twisted cast on of 2 stitches. So twist our working yarn, create a stitch, twist our working yarn, create a stitch. And again, to prevent the hole between my 2 working needles, I'm going to slip those initial 4 stitches here. come back all the way around and knit those 9 stitches we had slipped off the back needle. Want to make sure we're doing this fairly tight. So using the tip of our needle, we just don't want a hole between our twisted stitches or like our twisted cast on and our live stitches. So just knit all the way across. Okay, now I'm going to slip 3 of those stitches here back onto my front needle. So 2 of the original 9 I had slipped, and then 1 of the twisted cast on stitches. Just slip those back. 1, 2, 3. And I should now have 11 stitches on my front needle. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. And now we have to have 11 stitches here, and to do that we're just going to pick up that 1 stitch in between our 2 fingers. Over here we see the 2 legs of that cast on stitch, the twisted cast on stitch. We're going to pick those 2 up. And then I just like to pick up 1 of the stitches here, whatever yarn I can find that will close this gap between my picked up stitch and the live stitches. Pick up both legs, and I like the look of this yarn right here. So I'm just going to knit that. Find it a little bit easier to use the left needle and slip the stitches to kind of knit it. Okay, put that on the needle. Tighten it up. Make sure there is no hole in between those 2 stitches. It looks good, so I'm going to keep it. Just want to make sure we have 11 stitches here. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. So now we know we have another 22 stitch round. So now we're ready to just go back around and around. And for our middle finger, we're going to work 42 rounds. So I'm going to just knit this first stitch. Making sure it's fairly tight. The first round is a little bit more difficult just because we have our cast on stitches and our picked up stitches. Okay. Just knit all the way across. When we get to that twisted stitch, we don't want to work it like we would a normal knit stitch because we would undo the twist in the cast on stitch. So we're going to work it through the back loop, just knit it through the back loop. Just like so. So you can see I've started knitting the middle finger. I've knit a few more rounds and our finger's starting to take shape. When we inspect the closure between our 2 fingers, we don't see any large gaps, so we know we picked up the correct threads, just so we close that gap. And if we do have a slight gap, we can always use that tucked in tail to sew it closed if we need to. At this point, the knitting is actually fairly straightforward and simple. The needles that hold our remaining live stitches don't really affect our work. It's just those beginning rounds that are a little bit tricky to work. So for our middle finger, we work these just the same way we did for our index finger. First row of the fingertip shaping is to work knit 2 together all the way across our round. 2 together, making sure the first one's fairly tight so we don't have a hole. And knit 2 together all the way across. We're going to take the first stitch from our front needle and just slip that all the way to the back, making sure not to twist that stitch in any way. So I'm going to just make it a line so that it matches the other stitches. Now we're just going to knit 2 together all the way across, making sure again that first stitch is tight. So now for our second row, we're going to work knit 2 together, knit 1 all the way across our round. So knit 2 together, making sure it's slightly tight. Knit 1, knit 2 together, oops, looks like I dropped that stitch. Let me just rework it. So we now have reduced our stitches from 11 to 3 on our front needle. And then we're going to work the same pattern on the back needle. I'm going to start with the knit 1. And knit 2 together. Knit 1. And my last knit 2 together. On our back needle, we've reduced our stitches from 11 to 4 for a total of 7 stitches in our final round. From this point on, we're going to cut our working yarn, leaving about a 2 to 3 inch tail. And now we're going to thread our tapestry needle. Just like so, and slip our stitches onto our needle and pull through, pull through. Looks like I just dropped those stitches. No worries though, they didn't undo. Just rethreading my needle and pulling through. Making sure my needle is actually threaded properly. Pulling through. Now pulling the last 4 stitches. And pulling through tightly. So now we don't have a hole across our final stitches. It's all nice and tight, and we'll be able to weave in this end on the wrong side of our work. So now to work the ring finger, I'm going to slip 9 stitches from the front needle of my hand. Just like so. And 9 stitches from the back needle. Like this. So like last time, we're going to pick up 2 stitches in between our finger where we have our previously cast on stitches. So we can see our cast on edge. We have these 2 legs at the front, and we want to make sure we only pick up the second one to start, making sure we're picking up both legs of that stitch, as well as some extra yarn over here to close that gap between our live stitches and our picked up stitches. And you can pick up whatever yarn you want, just make sure it's not creating a hole. So this one looks good to me. I'm going to pick that up. and use my working yarn to work our stitch, making sure I'm leaving a 2 to 3 inch tail to weave in my ends later and potentially close any holes I have in this gap if I didn't pick up my stitches properly. So I like to work just slipping these picked up threads. So it looks okay, and if I knit across my first live stitch, there doesn't seem to be a noticeable gap, so I'm going to keep it. I'm going to continue knitting all the way across. There we go. I'm going to cast on 2 stitches from this point on using the same twisted cast on method. So 1, 2, turn my work to face the back needle. Like I said before, to help reduce the gap between my front and back needle, I'm going to slip 4 stitches from my original front needle and use that to help me knit across to get a nice tight gap. Two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. I'm going to slip 3 of those stitches from the front of my needle back onto my original front needle. 2, 3. And now I'm going to go pick up my last stitch in between this cast on edge. So find that stitch. Make sure we're picking up both legs, just like so. And we have to pick up a yarn anywhere in this closure area just so we have a nice tight closure. I'm gonna then knit all my stitches together. Find it's easier to do one at a time. Just like so. And if I examine that, there don't seem to be any noticeable holes. I'm gonna keep it. This point on, I'm just going to continue knitting all the way across my rounds. Again, that first round is a little bit tricky because we have our stitches and our yarn tails getting in the way. Just working across that first needle. When we get to the last stitch, we want to make sure we're knitting it through the back loop so that we're not undoing that cast on edge. Pull my original tail tightly. Turn my work. The front stitch of the back needle, I'm going to make sure again I'm working it through the back loop so not to undo that cast on edge. Also make sure you're working it fairly tightly using the tip of the needle. And just knitting the rest across. So after 3 rows, it should be fairly simple to work our ring finger. You can start tucking in the tail at this point inside the finger. And we're going to work our ring finger for a total of 36 rows before working the tip shaping. Just like before in the other 2 fingers, we're going to work our first round, knit 2 together all the way across. So we're going to work knit 2 together. Let's work a knit 2 together. Using the tip of our needle to tighten that stitch so we don't get a gap. Just working knit 2 together. Just like so. We're going to take our last stitch from our front needle, slip that to the back needle. Want to make sure our stitches aren't twisted in any way. Here I slipped it on as if to purl, so I'm going to slip it on as if to knit so that it matches my other stitches. Now I'm going to knit the 2 together, tightening that first stitch so we don't get a gap between our needles, and then working the 2 together all the way to the end. Going back to the front of our glove, we're now going to work a knit 2 together, knit 1 all the way across our round. So knit 2 together, knit 2 together, tightening that first stitch so we don't get a gap between our needles, knit 1, and knit 2 together. We reduced the number of stitches on the front needles from 11 to 3. Now we're just going to work that pattern all the way across the back needle. I'm going to start off with the knit 1, tightening that first stitch, then working knit 2 together, knit 1, knit 2 together. So now I reduced the number of stitches on the back needle from 11 to 4 for a total of 7 stitches remaining in my round. Now I'm going to cut my tail, leaving about 2 to 3 inches for me to thread my tapestry needle. Tapestry needle is threaded. I'm just going to slip those stitches from the needle, my knitting needle, to the tapestry needle and pull the yarn through. Repeat that on the back, slipping the remaining 4 stitches and pulling through, tightening that final round. So now you can see we don't have any holes and we can just weave this tail in on the wrong side of our knitting. It's time to work the final finger, the pinky. And for this, we're also going to just increase 2 stitches in between our fingers. So again, we have our cast on stitch, another cast on stitch. We can see those really prominent legs. So with one of my needles, I'm going to pick up both legs of that cast on stitch as well as any yarn in between here so that I don't get a hole between my live stitches and my picked up stitches. Leave about a 2 to 3 inch tail and then knit those stitches. I find it easier, again, just to slip those stitches one at a time over my working yarn rather than pulling through all at once. I'm actually going to increase this tail. I wanted it to be a little bit longer, just like so. I'm going to knit across my remaining live stitches. So when I double check that joint, I want to see little to no gaps. This looks good to me, so I'm going to continue knitting across. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 7, 8. Plus the stitch we just picked up in the back and between our 2 fingers. That's a total of 9 stitches in our front needle. Turning my work, I'm now going to just knit across the remaining 8 stitches of the hand. Making sure that first stitch is nice and tight so I don't have any gaps between my needles. And then just knitting all the way across. Like so. At this point, I'm going to pick up another stitch between my 2 fingers so I can see that cast on edge, pick up both legs of that stitch, as well as, whoops, so pick up both legs of that stitch, as well as some yarn in between the live stitches and the cast on edge to help decrease that gap between the stitches. I'm going to knit all of that together to form one stitch, like so, for a total of 9 stitches on each needle, front and back. So that would make an 18 stitch round. So at this point on, I'm actually going to take a stitch marker and put it across that first initial live stitch I just picked up. So in this row, it's really easy to tell which stitch is connected to that needle and which stitch is associated with our first row. And the reason we had to put a stitch marker here when we did it in all the other fingers is because if we picked up our stitches correctly, we should have an almost seamless joint, and that can make it really difficult to figure out where is the start of our finger, our first round. But this way we have a really obvious marker. We don't have to worry about starting and stopping. But if you look at the back needle, we have kind of a seamless joint if we picked up our stitches correctly. So it can be a little bit difficult to tell what is the first stitch. So at this point, I really don't interact with the yarn tail all that much. I can tuck it into the center of my finger. Just expand that and tuck it in, like so. So I'm going to continue knitting in the round for a total of 24 rounds and then work the fingertip shaping as before. I'm just going to work the fingertip shaping same way as before. So let me just adjust my yarn. First round, I'm going to start by working knit 2 together all the way across. Oops, let me just knit that together. Just like so. Tightening up that first stitch so we don't get a gap between our needles. And then continuing to work a knit 2 together. Now I'm going to slip that last stitch onto my back needle. And I'm going to continue working knit 2 together all the way to the end. Knit 2 together, tightening up that first stitch. Knit 2 together. Last knit 2 together. Okay. For my second round, I'm going to work knit 2 together, knit 1, just as before. So knit 2 together, tightening that first stitch, knit 1, slipping that last stitch to my back needle, continuing in the pattern, this time starting with a knit 2 together, knit 1, knit 2 together, knit 1. So I've reduced the number of stitches to 4 on my back needle, and I have 2 left on my front needle. At this point I'm going to cut my yarn, my working yarn, leaving again about a 2 to 3 inch tail. Going to thread my tapestry needle, and pull through all of my stitches. Just like so. Again, we have a nice tight closure at the tip of our finger, and we can now weave this tail in through the back side. So the last finger we have to work is the thumb. So let me just tuck in these tails into the actual hand. And for this, we're going to actually pick up our stitches from our waste yarn. I find this easier to do with a smaller needle. So for our thumb, we have a total of 20 stitches. So we're going to have 10 stitches on either side. Six, 7, 8, 9, and for the last few stitches you might see it's a little bit hard to pull. Just gonna use my tapestry needle to pull that waste yarn and tug it up to lift my actual stitch. So that's one of the reasons I find it so much easier to pick up those stitches from the waste yarn using smaller needles. For whatever reason, the yarn seems to relax when it's on waste yarn, and the stitches almost undo themselves. And it's a lot easier to pick up with just a smaller needle. You're not having to stretch the stitches nearly as much as you would with a larger needle. So at this point, I'm just going to pull my waste yarn, remove it, and I'm just left with my live stitches on my 2 smaller needles. To start my round, I'm going to start it in the same spot as the other fingers, which is in between this juncture point. Right where I have my cast on stitches, you can see my cast on, 1 stitch, second cast on stitch. I'm going to pull up the 2 legs of my cast on stitch as well as a bit of yarn anywhere here that is going to help me knit that stitch closed. Leaving about a 2 to 3 inch tail and picking up a stitch in between my thumb and my hand. Double checking that that stitch doesn't create any holes. I like the look of that, so I'm going to keep knitting across. Like so. And the last thing to do is to pick up another stitch between the thumb and the hand. I'm going to pick up those 2 legs of the cast on stitch, as well as some yarn in between my live stitches and my cast on, and I'm going to knit those together to create my stitch. Again, slipping the yarns one at a time, find it a bit easier. So now I should have a 22 stitch round with 11 stitches on either side of my needle. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 on the back needle, and 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 on my front needle. Like we did for the pinky, if we have a nice seamless joint, it's going to be difficult to see where we started, so I'm going to put my stitch marker right in that first stitch to denote my first round. From this point on, we can tuck in the tail if we want, and we can just keep knitting in stockinette stitch all the way until we have 24 total rounds. So I've just completed 24 rounds for my thumb, and I'm now ready to work the fingertip shaping. As before, I'm going to work knit 2 togethers all the way across my very first stitch, making it nice and tight, and continuing knit 2 togethers. Going to take that last stitch, slip it onto the back needle, just like so. Make sure it isn't twisted in any way and that it's oriented to match the previous stitches. I'm going to knit 2 together, tightening up that first stitch to avoid any holes between our needles. And knitting 2 together all the way to the end of my round. One more. Now for my second round, I'm going to work knit 2 together, knit 1 all the way across my round. Knit 2 together, tightening up that first stitch, knit 1, and knitting 2 together, making sure I'm not splitting that yarn. Just like so. On the back needle, I'm going to continue that pattern, starting with a knit 1, tightening up that stitch, working a knit 2 together, knit 1, knit 2 together. So I reduced the number of stitches from 11 to 3 on my front needle and to 4 on my back needle. Now I'm ready to cut my yarn, leaving about a 2 to 3 inch tail, and I'm going to weave in the ends like before using my tapestry needle. Thread my tapestry needle, and then I'm going to slip those stitches onto my tapestry needle, pull through, and pull through. So now I have my finished glove. The only thing left to do is to weave in my ends.